Can you hear me okay? Uh, 2 days ago in the first Dharma talk, a question was raised about thoughts that may remain as you begin Zazen, perhaps thoughts about recent events at work or whatever. And the question was, as I had mentioned, hindrances, if the practice is true and proper in accord with the Dharma, these hindrances themselves can become opportunities, openings, rather than something that gets in the way of our practice. I trust you can now see from your own experience over the last few days that in time, yes, it does take time, but through proper and patient, humble practice, those discursive thoughts dissolve of their own accord. If not, see what you're doing wrong and correct it. To be quite blunt, finally, what do you have to do with those thoughts and or feelings that may arise in your practice? Again, to be blunt, I would say, not a thing, not one thing. Of course, you don't embrace them and go along with them, but you don't need to push them away, deny, reject, or suppress them either. In a sense, this is also playing into them, following along, perhaps in a negative way. You don't need to do anything with those apparently hindering thoughts and feelings. If you simply return right here to what is underfoot immediately, to the direct, immediate practice, for example, through the breath itself, not the thought of the breath, but the breath itself. Those thoughts and feelings that may even seem to be attacking you, they just lose their power. If this is not what is going on, and again, it can take some time, usually a day or two, if they're not dissolving of their own accord, see what you're doing wrong. See how you are feeding them. Perhaps you're not conscious of it. You're not fully aware of what you're doing, but you must be in some way feeding them. And again, trying to reject them or push them away is also a way of feeding them. So you need to see what your mind is doing. And if the practice is correct, in time, most people it takes a day or 2 or 3 at the most of sustained practice. And you can see they dissolve of their own accord. Again, if not, see what you're doing wrong and correct it. To put this in a clearer perspective, there was a Chinese monk of the 9th century, Chinese pronunciation, Yangshan. And he asked his teacher, quote, "How long have you been without defiling thoughts and emotions?" A similar expression to what I mentioned before about the defiling or discursive or delusive thoughts and emotions hidden in lotus, in the lotus threads. So now the question, very practical, the monk disciple is asking his teacher in all frankness and honesty, how long have you been without any defiling thoughts and emotions? How long has it been since those discursive, delusive thoughts and emotions disappeared? His teacher, named Guishan in Chinese, how did Guishan respond to this? By way of background, this kind of question is found in Zen texts, but it's not common. It's actually asking, in a sense, in a very traditional Buddhist way, about the removal, the complete removal of any kind of delusions, any kind of hindrances, any kind of defilements, thoughts and emotion. Zen tends not to go there because they like to speak about it more embracingly in terms of the mind itself and the fundamental delusion that is there. Perhaps what's called the non-duality between defilement and awakening. But here the question is quite clear and quite explicit. Teacher, how long have you been without any delusion? How did the teacher Guishan respond? He said, 7 years. Hakuin mentions this. It's also mentioned as a koan in the collection called Entangling Vines, the Shumon Kattoshu in Japanese. Let us look for a moment at this important exchange and also at these two Chinese monks, the monk Yanshan and his teacher Guishan, who responded 7 years. They were so important that these two, Guishan and Yanshan, came to be known as one of the 5 Zen houses or Zen styles of classic Chan, Chinese Zen. By the way, they lived at the same time as Lin Chi or Rinzai, the father of Rinzai Zen, another one of these important 5 houses or schools. But this style or school that developed between Guishan, the master, and his disciple Yanshan, is said to be friendly and informal, like father and son. There is such a Zen style. Compare it, for example, with the style of Rinzai, Linchi or Rinzai, a classic statement from his record of Rinzai. He says, "Elsewhere the dead are cremated. Here I bury them alive, right on the spot." This is not friendly and formal and informal like father and son. This is Rinzai Zen. It's interesting to compare it to the style of Guishan and Yanshan. As a matter of fact, in the second half of the record of Rinzai, you will find these two monks, Guishan and Yanshan, commenting on the mondo, the Zen exchanges in the record of Rinzai, showing obviously a great degree of respect for these two monks. They're the ones that get a place in actually commenting, almost making fun of sometimes, Rinzai. They also mention what eventually came to be called the capping phrases in Zen koan practice. For example, one classic phrase, again, this is mentioned in the record of Rinzai, but it's actually put in the mouth of Guishan. He says, have a child and you understand a father's love. Have a child and you understand a father's love. Also very famous in the record of Rinzai, and again, it's not Rinzai saying it, but Guishan. Realization equaling the masters diminishes it by half. Only surpassing realization continues this lineage. Guishan wrote a kind of a poetic statement called his admonitions, warnings or admonitions. It's the first Zen text published in Japan. And it includes one of the most, perhaps the most famous statement, inquire exhaustively into the Dharma principle. Take awakening as your standard, end quote. The second half, take awakening as your standard, is often used, for example, by Dahui or Dae, who developed the introspecting, looking into the koan Zen practice. Notice he's not saying take sitting practice, zazen, as your standard, but awakening itself as your standard. This master, Guishan, is also the monk who kicked over the water pitcher and thus became abbot of a monastery. You may have read about this in the Mumon Kan, or Gateless Barrier, case 40. Some years later, a master refused to indulge one of his brilliant disciples. Eventually, that disciple was deeply awakened when stone struck bamboo. The master was Guishan. Enough said. But 7 years, needless to say, this may sound discouraging, but it's meant as encouragement, an invitation to genuine, thoroughgoing practice. Let us look again at that 7 years. There are a couple of versions of this mondo or exchange between the monk Yanshan and the master Guishan. For example, in the koan collection, Entangling Vines, there's a bit of a longer version, and it goes like this. Guishan, the master, is asking, okay, Guishan, quote, he's asking his monk disciple, Yanshan, how long have you been without defiling thoughts and emotions? The disciple Yanshan didn't answer, it says, but instead asked Guishan, how many years has it been for you? The master Guishan then says, already 7 years since this old monk, referring to himself, already 7 years since this old monk ended it. And you? The monk Yanshan. With me, it still needs settling. It's difficult to translate. In other words, there's still something unruly. There's still some refining necessary. So now perhaps you think that Master Grishan was enlightened, but his disciple Yanshan was not. But that too is a delusive thread. Let it go. Grishan, the master, is right where he needed to be. And his monk disciple Yanshan was right where he needed to be. You and I, we are right where we need to be. And our sincere practice, our humble gratitude can show the way from here. As mentioned 2 days ago, Hakuin, the Japanese Zen master, Hakuin, summed up the essential point of real practice by saying, the Mu Koan is one method that cuts through the subtle roots of birth and death. Gnaw on it, Hakuin says. Chew it to pieces until you chew right through the root of life. Finish dying, then come back to life. Don't wait till you're old and tears of regret are streaming down your cheeks, Hakuin concludes. I trust you can see through this mondo, this exchange, how important the right approach to practice, how important that is, how important sustained focus is, how important living a proper lifestyle day to day, moment to moment, in accord with this Dharma, how important this is. And in time, the impossible, what seemed impossible, is found to be inevitable. It cannot help but occur. If not, humbly see how you are falling back into delusive patterns, including the delusion that you are now free of delusion. There's nothing in those lotus threads, huh? Humbly correct it. This is real practice. Let us continue, there are still a few days left, together to the very end, then out of loving compassion, even further. Feel free to stand up and stretch for a moment if you would like. I would like to leave plenty of time for questions and concerns from out of the practice, but let me touch on one more point, which can be really helpful in the middle of a retreat. One of Hakuin, the Japanese Zen master, Hakuin's disciples named Torei, wrote a piece. And in there he said, quote, all the old masters attained the way only by bitter suffering. That could also be translated by, rather than bitter suffering, maybe through difficult struggle. All the old masters attained the way through difficult struggle. End quote. Well, it's true. We do have to give all of ourselves. But much of the suffering that we go through in the process is not necessary. Those pointless, painful patterns repeated over and over again, they are not necessary. I still have an American passport, so you will excuse me for quoting Henry David Thoreau, one of our greats. In the opening chapter of Walden, he wrote, quote, "The mass of men," that means all of us, "the mass of men lead lives of quiet desperation," end quote. Again, the mass of men lead lives of quiet desperation, end quote. And I reckon for any genuine spiritual path, a kind of desperation is needed. Why would you begin on the path without it? But it needs to be a healthy despair, an honest anguish that calls naturally from the depths of our being, that reveals the self-deception underneath, the deceit, the duplicity of the ego self. This can give the needed impulse to realize, to fulfill the practice, not just to desire it. Mere desire is not enough. If it remains something merely desirable, a possibility, well, then face it. It is impossible. And your wavering mind, has made it so. When it is what must be done, in time, it will be done. But again, that desperation does need to be directed properly. It can't be forced, nor should it be borrowed or imitated. This is the importance of deepening and sustaining samadhi, that concentrated oneness, with patience and humility. To, as Hakuin puts it, finish dying and come back to life, ready for a lifetime of maturing practice. Otherwise, as mentioned 2 days ago, a perfect zazen posture, so-called kensho experiences and so on, can do more harm than good. Please beware. You have everything that you need. Use it well. If anyone has a question or concern from out of the practice, please speak up for the benefit of all. Thank you for listening so intently.
If you'd like to ask a question or offer a comment, please unmute yourself and go ahead. Thank you.
Okay. Good evening to all. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Thank you. Good evening to everyone. My question is, what is the place of self-compassion in Zen practice?
The place of self-compassion?
Yes, in the practice.
Mm-hmm. In the beginning, it might be good to put self-compassion on the back burner, so to speak. Do you know that expression? It's like an oven with a couple of burners, and you keep it there, but it's not on the front, it's on the back burner. You don't pay attention to it so much. The idea, very basic in Mahayana Buddhism, that we begin the practice to save all beings. It's not just about me. It can't be just about me. But in the beginning, it often is. I know it was with myself. So practically speaking, there's an importance, a value to putting that self-centeredness on the back burner for now. And as you go through the practice and you see why, for example, the 4 great vows of Mahayana Buddhism, it begins with numberless beings set free. Not first I get enlightened for myself. It makes perfect sense. I get enlightened for myself, then I can help others. Doesn't this make sense? But it doesn't. It begins with numberless beings, all beings set free. Then the second vow is endless delusion. Now looking more at our delusions, let go. There's an important dynamic here. But if you give yourself to the practice, before long, you will see that that very distinction no longer needs to be made. Who am I practicing for? Me? You? I forget.
I see.
We don't need to make that distinction. But in the beginning, how to say it? You have to be clear about the source of your own suffering. Do you understand?
Yes.
But you also have to be clear that you are doing this not just for yourself. As you open up to your own suffering, what happens? You see it, don't you, huh? You start to be able to recognize really from the inside the suffering of others too, don't you?
Yeah.
Do you follow?
Yes, I do. But there's one thing I cannot really figure out. If one cannot carry himself, if one cannot have the compassion for him or herself, cannot really have the authentic compassion for the others. That's why I said, what is the importance of it?
Yes. Often people do come to this practice with a kind of perhaps broken faith in themselves. And you're quite right. If you can't accept yourself in some sense, you can't even begin the practice. In other words, to accept myself doesn't mean, oh, I'm perfect. I'm already enlightened. I don't have to. No, rather, to accept yourself means to honestly see you have strengths, don't you? You have weaknesses too, don't you? There are things that you see clearly, don't you? And there are things that you do not. You follow? So in Zen, for example, we emphasize the importance of great trust or faith, but also great doubt about that which we have not yet penetrated. We cannot help but have doubt. But yes, you have to have a certain sense of self-acceptance to really begin the practice. So don't be afraid of that. Huh? Do you know what I mean? It's not necessarily egotism that is doing that. It's a genuine need to get to the bottom of yourself, for yourself and for others. So don't be afraid of that. It can be easily perverted into, I have to deny myself, right? I have to deny myself and just serve others. Huh?
Yeah.
I've been doing that for the last year after I retired, and I ended up getting pretty sick. I learned my lesson well. In Zen, we say, sickness is its own medicine. This is hard for the ego self to get wrap its mind around, isn't it? Huh? What? No, sickness. I want the medicine now. I know my sickness. What's the medicine? But do you see the profound truth that sickness itself is its own medicine? I've learned a lot from trying to push myself. Since I retired last year, now I have all this time to be able to be there for others. And I pushed that so much, I ended up getting sick myself. Pretty stupid, huh? What happened to doctor, heal thyself? So I've learned a valuable lesson from my own sickness, something that you are already getting a sense of. Yeah, don't be afraid to care for yourself. But see it through. Is that what you call the self, separate from the other? Is it?
Yeah, I got the point now. Yes. Now I got the point. Thank you.
Thank you for your question. Again, it's not just yours.
Thank you for answering. Thank you very much.
Jeff, I have a question.
Yes.
You said that painful patterns are not necessary. And I want to ask you, if you find that the same painful patterns keep coming up over and over and over again for a long period of time, that means that you are doing something wrong. Is that what you're saying? Or not?
Yes. Yes. You're doing something wrong in the sense that you are continuing to follow out these non-productive, non-helpful, painful, bitter patterns, right?
Yeah.
And you may not be able to see how it is actually playing itself out. You just find yourself all of a sudden in the middle of the pattern, don't you?
Yeah.
You follow, by the time you recognize it, you say, I'm already 3 miles down the road here. And I've been here 1,000 times before, and I know it doesn't go anywhere.
Right.
But the mind doesn't know what else to do. At least you're familiar with this, aren't you? It doesn't really solve anything, and you're not really happy with it, but at least you know you're familiar with it, huh? And that's what the mind will do. It will recreate that scenario. Sound familiar? Over and over and over again, even though you may be sick and tired of it. It doesn't know what else to do. And this is the marvel of, it's not the only practice there is, but Zen meditation, Zazen. Because it's just very simply disconnecting that whole thing, refusing to go down that dead end again. The way we place our body, the way we place our mind and our attention, the way we place our eyes, everything that we are doing in Zazen is helping us physically, mentally, with the breath itself, to let go of those pointless, painful patterns. And yes, especially in the beginning, it's hard work. I struggled with it for a long time. I thought at one point I would never get out of it. Just impossible. If I didn't choose one delusion, I would go for another one. But if you give yourself patiently and humbly to the practice, you can see something starts to open up. Something starts to dislodge. You're familiar with this, aren't you?
Yes.
Alan? Yes. Okay. So you continue to go in that direction. You might say the trick, if I use that term, the trick is to drop those patterns without picking up another one. because that is also what the mind wants to do, right? Okay, I've seen how painful this pattern is. Now Jeff is teaching me a Zen pattern. Now I'm going to do that one. Well, it may be a bit of a bigger pattern, but you're still going in the same circles, aren't you? So consider, what if you drop the patterns and don't pick up another one? You really need them. What would happen if you don't pick up another pattern? I
But
dare you.
that's a choice. It's a choice that you're making.
In a sense, yes, but it's often not conscious, is it?
Okay.
That's the right. It's already done. It's done in a sense without you even thinking about it. By the time you really clearly think about it, you're already, as I said, 3 miles down the road, right? You follow? So yeah, not just a decision, but there has to be a certain attentiveness there. That's why I keep talking about sustained practice. You follow? But it's right there, Colin, right where you are at this present moment. Do you go down that road or not? Zazen is simply refusing to go down that road again, remaining right here without manipulating it in the least, without having to turn it into anything. You follow? It's the sheer simplicity that makes it seem so difficult. You want to say anything else, Colin? Again, this is not just your concern.
No, I think what you're saying is that there's no shortcut, and devotion to the practice is the way to refuse to entertain unnecessary pain. I think, is that what you're saying?
Try it out.
Okay.
Test it yourself and see.
Okay.
You
Yes.
already know what going down those painful roads is like, don't you?
Yes.
Okay. So now, when that starts to happen, simply bring the mind back with the breath and with the attention. Where? Right here, right here, right here, right here. And then you'll start to see, I don't need to go down that road or any road. I don't need to do that. It's only the mind's inherent unsteadiness, wavering, that makes it constant, right? I've got to get away from this or get closer to that, right? Get away from what I dislike and get closer to what I like. It's a constant dis-ease, isn't it? And you don't put an end to it by following one more road. It just extends the disease. Zazen is stopping the whole thing and then seeing what's there. And when you really see that, you don't go chasing again. Thank you for your question, Colin.
Thank you, Jeff.
If there are no more questions or comments, Milan, would you like to take a 15-minute break and then tomorrow be back? I'll be back for one-on-one and the following day for the third and final Dharma talk. Good?
Thank you, Jeff. We'll take a 15-minute break and meet at noon New York time for London.